Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here and to be receiving an honorary degree tomorrow from Radboud University. Let's see, down is forward. Okay. I only have 20 minutes with you tonight, so I'll probably be talking a little bit fast toward a science of diversity for urban schools in the United States. So I'm going to be talking about issues of diversity within the United States, but maybe you can generalize to some of the things that I have to say about our schools to your situation here in the Netherlands. Let me just start quickly by telling you a little bit more about who I am. I wear 3 hats, I think. First of all, I'm a developmental social psychologist. That means I study people and context. I study how you feel about yourself, how you think other people feel about you, how other people feel about you. That's what social psychologists study. And social psychologists have also been at the forefront of research on addressing social problems. So I try to use my social psychology lens to address social problems. You'll see what they are in a minute. I'm also a developmental social educational psychologist. I think that the children's social lives and their academic lives are intertwined, and you can't understand academic achievement without understanding the social milieu. So I study social psychological processes in educational contexts. And my third hat is that I'm an African-American developmental social educational psychologist. So if I'm going to be studying social problems in the educational context, I'm going to be focusing on issues of racial ethnic diversity. Okay? So what do I do? What social problems do I study within the school context and that center race ethnicity? Well, to set the context, this is a figure that shows the changing racial landscape in the United States for the past 100 years or so. It's a good thing I can barely see this myself. I may have to turn around here to see some of my slides. That's pretty far away. But what you can see, every 10 years we do a census in the United States where we survey among other things, the racial ethnic composition of the population. And this is census data every 20 years for the past century, beginning in 1920 up through 2020. We had a census in 22 and projecting out for 20 to 40 years. There's a couple of things that are very clear here. The chartreuse, I think, are white people in the United States, and the light blue, are African Americans. And you can see that in 1920, we were a biracial society. About 90% of the population was white, and a very small 10% of it was African American or black. The other racial ethnic groups weren't even counted back then. You can see over time, over this course of 100 years, this has been an era of tremendous racial transformation. When you look at 2020, you can see that whites have gone from being 90% of the population to really just barely cross. That dotted line is 50%, still a little bit more than 50% of the population, but decreasing. And Latinos or Hispanics, we have different terms. I use the word Latino or Latinx in California. Latinos are the largest racial ethnic minoritized group now. Asians are actually the fastest growing group, but the point is that by 2060, projecting out to the end there, whites are no longer going to be the numerical majority group in this country. We will truly be a multiracial, multi-ethnic society. This is tremendous transformation over the past 100 years. So with my interest in kids, you can ask, well, does the racial ethnic composition of the school-age population, the kids who are under 18, does that mirror the national data? When you focus on kids that are on the under 18 population, demographic changes are going to be more rapid because of an immigration that's primarily non-white and different birth rates in different racial ethnic groups. So this next slide here, this is from the NCES, is the National Center for Educational Statistics, the best source of demographic data in the country on American public schools. These are public schools. And this is just over the last 40 years or so, from 1968 to 2020. The same pattern you see in the under 18 population, except it's going more rapidly. For example, in 1968, 80% of the kids in public schools in the US, this is the national sample, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about particular context. 80% of the kids in public schools were white. By 2020, only 46%. African Americans, we've stayed relatively the same size in the last 40, 50, 100, really 100 years. Latinos are again the fastest fastest growing group. And so what's important here is that 2020 is really like the 2040 when you look at the national statistics. And pretty soon, schools are going to become the first major institution in the US without a clear racial ethnic majority. Again, that's truly transformative. So the question you can ask, well, the population is becoming really more racially ethnically diverse. There's no question about that. Are the schools also keeping up with the racial ethnic diversity of the population? Unfortunately, the answer to that question is a resounding no. If you were to come to the US and randomly pick a school throughout the country, walk through the doors, sit in the lunchroom, sit in the cafeteria, go hang out in the hallways or on the playgrounds, you'll see that our schools are actually more segregated now than they were in the 1950s following the landmark Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision that outlawed school segregation. The typical white student attends schools where 80% of the kids are white. The typical African American or Latino student attends schools where at least 3/4 of the population are their own racial ethnic group. And highly segregated inner city schools are often located in areas of concentrated poverty, which makes the challenges of lack of diversity even more great. This next figure here shows you the 5 largest school districts in the United States. New York is the largest. They have about 1 million kids. LA, Los Angeles Unified School District, where I am, is the second largest. It's shrinking. Public school populations are shrinking, but it's still the second largest with 500,000 to 600,000 students. And these other 3, these account for about 3 to 4 million kids in the US. And what you see here is that these central city schools are highly segregated. The bottom graph there, it's blue on mine, sort of blue on yours too. Those are the white students in these schools. These large central city school districts are primarily racial ethnic minority. If I had more time, I'd show you the population of these cities. It does not mirror the racial segregation in the schools. And one of the challenges we face is that, there's so much focus on why would this be? Why do we have these segregated schools? But many of the important landmark Supreme Court decisions that came after Brown v. Board of Education, that's being gradually rolled back. The latest Supreme Court decision, which outlawed affirmative action in higher education in the US, it's no longer a compelling interest to have diverse higher education. That's going to trickle down and affect the public schools also. There's no longer going to be a compelling interest to have racially integrated schools. And so part of the challenge is that so much of why this negative anti-integration thinking is emerging is that it's sometimes easy for people to dismiss the research that's been done as outdated. A lot of it is older, too focused on black-white comparisons. That's true because in the desegregation movement, it was primarily black and white. If you look at my data before, this is no longer the way the world is, at least in the US. And often it was dismissed as methodologically weak, theoretically impoverished. It's been easy for people to dismiss this work as not important. And there's some what I call scary quote. Well, it's getting worse. That from 2001 to 2014, for example, the percentage of public schools with majority poor Black and Latino kids, that increased from 9 to 16%. But this is a big number because we're talking about 50 million kids who are going to public schools in the US. Scary quotes, I like this one because it's really scary. There are many things we need to do to address the achievement gap, but worrying about the racial composition of schools is not one of them. That could not be more incorrect. Just showing you this is an important figure from actually 2003, but it's still so relevant. On the y-axis, you see the black-white achievement gap, the differences in achievement between black students and white students. On the x-axis, you see segregation. There are many wonderful indices of segregation. For the purposes of this, the higher the number here, the more segregated schools. And you can see this correlation. As schools become more segregated, the black-white achievement gap increases. Just showing you of some of the evidence about this. The test score gap is almost 50% larger in states with the highest segregation compared to those with the lowest. Minority youth in high minority K-6 schools, that's up to about 11 or 12 in our US context, end up 5 months behind comparable peers attending ethnically diverse schools. This is really worrisome. And so what I've argued is that in order to counter the arguments that so many people make about we don't need to worry about racial ethnic diversity, I think what we need is methodologically rigorous research. We need to counter the arguments that the research about the value of diversity is not very rigorous. We need multiple racial ethnic groups. Yes, this is no longer a black-white issue in the US. We need good measures of diversity. We need to counter the arguments that the work is methodologically weak. And we need to be posing testable hypotheses that focus on how diversity matters rather than if it is. It's no longer a question about if, it's how diversity matters. So that's what we try to do in our research, do rigorous research with multiple groups, with good measures of diversity, with testable hypotheses about how diversity matters rather than if it does. Just to show you our working conceptual model, this work that I'm going to briefly talk about today, ever so briefly, I wish I had more of your time, focuses on middle schools in the US. That's the 6th through the 8th grade, the 11 to 12 to 14-year-olds, the early adolescents, the young adolescents. And here's our model. We start with ethnic diversity, a range of ethnic diversity. And our argument, this how argument, is that there's 3 parts to this. As ethnic diversity increases, there are more opportunities for, can you see that? There are more opportunities for cross-racial ethnic friendships and therefore the formation of cross-ethnic friendships. If you don't have diversity, if there's no availability, you're not going to be able to form cross-race ethnic friendships. The second part of this process model, this how, is that greater diversity leads to exposure to more racial ethnic groups and therefore the development of multiple social identities. I need to figure out who am I, who are we. Our argument is that when there's more diversity, you have more opportunities to do that. And the third big process here is that greater ethnic diversity leads to a balance of power among different racial ethnic groups, a numerical balance of power, and that in turn will reduce perceived vulnerability. And that these processes together influence intergroup attitudes, how I feel about other people, how other people feel about me. That's a social psychology question. And mental health and is critically important for kids' adjustment in school. And finally, these processes together will influence school functioning, including multiple indicators, your grade point average, your attendance, your attitudes, your engagement in school. In a couple of days, I'm going to be talking in the psychology department, and I'm going to be talking about work on school belongingness, which is an important part of school attitudes. So the argument that we want to make is diversity benefits everybody, not just the racial minoritized groups. It's an advantage for everybody, and that's the kind of argument that we want to make in our research. Just a bit, I'm just going to give you one example of this research that we have, but just a little bit about our sample. I do my research in California. You know, Los Angeles, the schools are 75% Latino, as I indicated before. We have to search throughout the state to find the diverse sample because I want to study all racial ethnic groups, and I want to study all the racial ethnic groups who are attending schools that vary in diversity. So we've had to look hard for this. So we have some schools where these are the major pan-racial ethnic groups. I'm making assumptions for the purposes of this talk. I do not believe that these groups are homogeneous, and there's a huge population of biracial, multiracial kids that are part of our research too that I'm not talking about today. So we've recruited a very diverse sample across these different schools, middle schools 26 that vary in diversity, and this is a large sample, and you can see that it's diverse. And for California, recruiting a diverse sample is, a challenge, but we did it. And the important thing here I want to underscore is that all the racial ethnic groups are represented across these different school types. Sometimes they're in schools where their group is the majority. Sometimes they're in what we call the balanced schools, 2 schools, and sometimes they're in very diverse schools. This over here, this is what I consider to be the ideal, a diverse school, multiple racial ethnic groups about equally represented. So what are we learning about this? I'm just going to give you one example, and because my friend Tone Salason is here and he studies school bullying, I'm going to give you an example of how we're arguing that diversity is related to more of a balance of power and less vulnerability among kids. Oh, before I go that, let me just go back for a minute. So, balance of power. So when people who study peer victimization, one of the major determinants of being a victim is if there's an imbalance of power. And mainly when we think about an imbalance of power, we think about older kids picking on younger kids or bigger kids picking on smaller kids. But thinking about diversity, you can also think of diversity as representing a balance or an imbalance of power. So when there's one large group, as in non-diverse schools, that group might be in a position to harass or pick on numerically smaller groups. So our argument is that in diverse schools, you have a greater numerical balance, and therefore you're going to have less vulnerability, less examples of peer victimization. And so that's what we found, and this is just one example. On the y-axis is adjustment. I look at here for illustrative purposes, school safety, loneliness, and perceived victimization. Am I the kind of kid who gets picked on a lot? And on the x-axis is increasing school diversity based on the way we measure it and study it. And you can see here that as school diversity increases, kids feel safer in school. That's really important. There's a lot of research in the US on perceived school safety. They also feel less lonely, and more importantly, for our purposes, they feel less victimized. School diversity, a greater balance of power, is one protective factor for experiences of victimization. So as a how am I doing? Am I good? Okay, do I have 5 minutes? Okay. So, as a social psychologist, I want to know why. What are the mechanisms? So one of the mechanisms that we're studying are the kinds of attributions that youth make about experiences with victimization. An attribution is a why question. Why did I be picked on? And what you don't want to happen is for young people to think it's my fault, this will always be this way, and there's nothing that I can do about it. We want to encourage attributions to other factors, and certainly multiple kinds of attributions. So we're also finding in our research that more diverse schools, I'm just going to show you this illustratively, the why me question, that we're finding that in more diverse schools, you're more likely to have multiple kinds of attributions. Maybe it's me, maybe it's them, maybe it's a combination of the two, whereas in these non-diverse schools, you're much more likely to be making a self-blaming attribution. And we know from lots of attribution research that when you blame yourself, that has negative psychological and behavioral consequences. So the mechanism, and we now have evidence of this even across, I just showed you our data for 6th grade, across the middle school years, that negative attributions go down in more diverse schools, and certainly peer victimization goes down in schools with greater diversity. So we feel pretty good about this. And if I had more time, I'd tell you the evidence for the other processes that I'm examining too. So what do I want to leave you with? Well, by way of summary, I think school racial ethnic diversity leads to more cross-racial ethnic friendships and more opportunities to form those friendships. And the contact hypothesis from social psychology tells us that when you have more contact with people who are different from you, you're more likely to have better attitudes about those people. We know that from our own research. Diversity promotes friendships and better attitudes about others. We also know that diversity promotes more complex social identities, and identity development is such a critical task of adolescence that I can try on multiple identities when I'm in more diverse contexts and exposed to people who are different from me. And finally, this one example that I gave you, diversity leads to less vulnerability, less feelings of victimization, and less blaming oneself for victimization. But the story is a lot more complicated than that because diversity has some challenges too. And these are 3 that I want to just highlight here. even in diverse schools, if there's what we call de facto segregation, so that some racial ethnic groups are segregated in their academic classes more than others, you're not going to have the opportunities for exposure to others that you would have in a truly diverse environment. In the US context, especially in the area of math, that we know, and this is a robust and unfortunate phenomenon that's part of the achievement gap, Black and Latino students do more poorly in these academic classes than white and Asian students. And if your instruction is organized to segregate people along their achievement in these important subject matter, and this starts in elementary school and continues through middle school and high school, you're not going to have many opportunities to interact with other people. So that's a challenge for diversity, de facto within school segregation. Critical mass, I really firmly believe that we've got to be studying kids in context and what's the size of your group. If your group is really small, which will happen in schools with multiple racial ethnic groups, so if you're in a school where there's only a few Turks or Moroccan kids or kids from Suriname, what's the likelihood that they're going to have opportunities or will want to have opportunities to interact with people from different racial ethnic groups? So the size of one's group is really something critical we need to be focusing on. Sometimes people do what we call, what Robert Putnam has called hunkering down, turn inward rather than reaching outward. And the final thing I want to say here is that even in diverse schools, kids have experiences with discrimination because of the unfortunate prevailing racial stereotypes that are out there, particular racial stereotypes associating violence and aggressiveness with being Black and male. To the degree that these stereotypes are prominent, even in diverse schools, you're going to have experiences with discrimination. So it's a challenge. Diversity is good, but the answer to achieving diversity is not a simple issue. And so what I think we need is a science of diversity. So for me, the two most important questions about diversity in the 21st century is, as diversity increases, first of all, do we provide equal opportunity and access to society's resources, including good schools? And the second big challenge for diversity is that when people of different racial ethnic groups come in contact with one another, voluntarily or involuntarily, how can we reduce racial prejudice and increase racial tolerance and respect for diversity? Those are the two critical questions in my mind that we're facing in our diverse context, in schools and in society at large. So I think we need what I call a developmental science. Diversity, a diverse science of diversity. Diversity is how people are different from one another and how they make meaning of it. I think we need to be thinking about diversity as something that's dynamic. It's changing. Everybody doesn't experience the school exactly the same when they enter that school door. We need to be thinking about it as diversity. We need to be focusing on a critical mass. How many people like me are really important? We need more than Black and white, and we need to rethink the meaning of ethnic minority. In our country, there's no longer, Black and Latino kids in particular are no longer going to be the numerical minority, so we need to rethink our meaning of the term racial ethnic minority. That's the challenge. That's what I want to do. And because I'm a developmental, social, educational psychologist who's also African American, that's what I try to do in my research. Thanks. I know I talked fast.
Well, thank you, Sandra Graham, for your quick and insightful talk about diversity in the US context. So it's my honor to follow up your talk about educational diversity in the Netherlands, and I link it also to issues of inequality. And I think it's good to have this the Netherlands USA comparison to see how different contexts create different fields of diversity and areas of discontent, and how we should understand our research in the different contexts. And you have 3 hats. I don't have hats anymore. I don't have hair anymore. But I have 3 spheres that I do my research on, especially because what we study in diverse classrooms is related to how we organize and structure our educational system. And I focus on the educational system. So how do we organize diversity in our context? How do we organize diversity in schools? And how do teachers organize diversity in their classrooms? So, as educational scientists usually do, they take problems from a multi-level and a multidisciplinary perspective, and I do as well. I also have some introductory slides on our education system to make the conversation a little bit more easy when we talk about the context of the USA and the Netherlands. So this is the Dutch educational system, which is quite typical for educational systems in this geographical area of Europe. So we have what we call a system of basic elementary education for all until grade 6. And after grade 6, we track students in different educational types, depending on their academic skills in primary education or elementary education. So countries in this area like Belgium, Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, they use this kind of educational system in which we track students quite early in the education system. This is a typical diversity creating context, and I will talk about that later. But this is really, really important to know when we study diversity in our educational context. We also have a very typical composition of diversity in European societies. The US has a very different history of diversity when it comes to Native Americans, European Americans, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, whatever. These groups are typical for the US context. So you have large groups that form substantial groups of different racial or ethnic backgrounds. But in our European context, diversity is much more diffuse, less pronounced in terms of great large numbers of people. We had in the past colonies, and we have some relations with our colonial overseas areas that brought people from colonies to the Netherlands. We had guest workers in the 60s, 70s that came from the Mediterranean countries that flew in. And then later we had refugees from all kinds of war zones that came to the Netherlands that created a very diverse society. But we don't talk much about race. We talk about backgrounds, migration backgrounds, immigrant backgrounds. And also in education, we don't speak easily about race, but we talk about being from a migrant background. And last year, the Central Bureau of Statistics in the Netherlands, they developed a new scheme because we used to use terms like Western and non-Western immigrants. So we have Western immigrants that look like us and who have similar cultures as the Netherlands, and non-Western backgrounds from different areas with more traditional values, other religions that would not easily fit into the Netherlands. So, for example, Western migrants came from neighboring countries like Germany, Belgium, but also from Japan and Australia and South Africa because they shared our culture, but they were considered to be Western immigrants. And non-Western immigrants, they came also from the West, from Suriname and the Caribbean islands, and they were considered to be non-Western. So we got a little bit mixed up in our geographical knowledge. So we had to redesign our ideas about migration. And now this is the new scheme. So back to the previous one. You are considered to be a migrant if you or one of your parents was born outside of the Netherlands. So you are then a migrant or a child of migrant. But if your parents were born in the Netherlands, you are not considered to have a migrant background. So we kind of neglect the cultural heritage of people with a longer history in the Netherlands. For example, people from the former colonies that are considered to be native Dutch inhabitants who share the culture of the Netherlands. So they may look different, but they are considered to be just as Dutch as the people who have a longer Dutch history. But this is a different concept of diversity than in the US, where race and racial expressions are much more dominant in the area of politics, but also in social sciences. So we now define migration in terms of the geographical area that people come from. So you say you're from Europe, or you're from Asia, or from America. So you tell where people come from, and that defines your background. It's a geographical history in terms of geographical region in the world. And if we look at the makeup of the Dutch society, you see that there is a very diverse composition of the Dutch population. So this is the migration background of 3.5 million migrants from that's of a total of 18 million Dutch citizens. It's quite a portion. And we see that most migrants come from Europe, and that we have a mixture of all kinds of regions. And you see at the end of this, these are other Asia, and these are mostly refugees from Syria that came to the Netherlands after the war. So we don't have large groups that form minorities. We used to have a lot of migrants from Turkey and Morocco that formed a substantial part of the migration, but now these groups are taken up as they become third-generation migrants and then considered to be native Dutch. So this is a history of migration, and it's important to keep this in mind when we talk about diversity. A quick note on diversity in schools. We have, in our elementary schools, we have public schools that are state-funded. So that means that we don't have private schools for parents who have money, who can send their children to private schools, as is the case in the US and in the UK as well, and in other countries. Because we have state-funded education for all kinds of denominational backgrounds, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, they can found their own schools with state support. So there's less need for private education in the Netherlands. So we have 3% of private education in the Netherlands. That's not that much. And as we have state-funded primary schools, most schools are mirrors of residential segregation. So we have segregated cities to a certain extent, and schools represent the segregation in cities. Illustrative example is the situation in The Hague and in Almere, which is a quite new city in the polder. The Hague is a quite segregated city, so we find much more segregation between schools in The Hague. In contrast to Almere, which is more diverse city and has less segregated schools. So most segregation between schools is the result of residential segregation, but also because of free school choice. We have free school choice, we have mandatory school choice, so you have to choose a school because otherwise you cannot bring your child to a school. So school choice in the Netherlands is mandatory. That's also different from other countries in which you are assigned a school if your child reaches a certain age. But free school choice adds to segregation because especially white parents, they tend to flee from diverse areas to send their children to more white schools. And that we call that white flight. And that kind of school choice behavior adds to school segregation. And segregation between schools in the Netherlands is considered to be moderate to high, especially in the cities. And it's moderately high and especially for Turks and Moroccan migrants, background students, and for students from low-educated families. So these groups are segregated by residential and choice segregation, and we see this intersectionality of educational background and cultural ethnic background, which is stronger even in secondary school. So if we go to secondary school, we group children in tracks based on teacher track recommendations. So the primary school teacher gives a track recommendation for students who are tracked in several types of secondary school. So you go to vocational education, general secondary education, or pre-university track. And these tracks are based on ability or performance, and that puts you in different schools. So you can imagine that this tracking adds to segregation. There are schools with multiple tracks, but also schools with single tracks. So the difference between schools in that sense, it matters for how you can be exposed to others, but it's more exposure if you are together in a classroom. But if we track them, we put students in different classrooms. So if we look at the effects of tracking, we see that in the lower tracks, which are the blue portions of these figures, we see that students without migration background or Western migration background, they have more, they are overrepresented in the pink areas, which are the general secondary education and pre-university tracks. And students from a non-Western background, so this is old language still, but it's in a recent report. So we're still in the transition to use different language. So the blue parts are the overrepresentation of the migrants in vocational education. So we see, if we track, that we track students in segregated schools. So we create more inequality by tracking. And it has detrimental effects, especially in the students from the lower tracks. So it has effect on their cognitive outcomes, so their learning gains, but also their motivation, their self-esteem, citizenship skills. So there are multiple domains, as Professor Graham also sketched, that students in low tracks, in segregated lower tracks, suffer from. And these are really sincere effects of tracking. And it reduces the opportunities to learn in diversity, or from diversity, or about diversity. So you limit the opportunities to learn in this diverse context. So what we would say is, let's get rid of this tracking. So I was part of the Education Council 3 years ago to write on this report. So it translates select later, differentiate better, to postpone tracking to the age of 15. So let's get rid of this early tracking and postpone it to 15, so we have 3 years of less segregated education for adolescents. So 3 years of non-tracked education, differentiation within schools and classroom, and no fixed tracks. So you can set students together for specific subjects, although, as Professor Graham showed for the example of mathematics, it also might have some negative segregation effects, but it's less problematic than having fixed tracks for all your subjects for the whole school life. So let's get rid of this. There is compelling research evidence that tracking has negative effects on students. But it's not easy, and I found these 3 challenges that Jeannie Oakes, who's a distinguished professor at Stanford University, sketched, and it's in a chapter by Adam Gameron. So we have different challenges to get rid of tracking. And these are currently core of the debate in the educational policy debate in the Netherlands. So there are strong beliefs that students differ in ability and that we should organize education to cater to this diversity. That's in our culture. We think about children in terms of ability levels. And it's very difficult to change that. We have political challenges because there are interests of some who don't want to get rid of tracking, especially though parents of high-achieving students and teachers who enjoy teaching these higher tracks. And we have technical challenges, which is quite dominant in teacher education discussions. It's too difficult for teachers to cater to the diversity of students. So we cannot give teachers the task to teach desegregated tracked schools. So it's not going to happen that easily, to my great frustration. And we also now see that there is more political disagreement. So if you look, we have elections in November. If you look at the programs of the parties, we see there is a division in the political arena regarding the support of detracking. So detracking is supported by Social Democrats and Green parties, but it's opposed against by conservatives and liberals. So our Liberal Party that was in power for the past 12, 13 years, the past years they moved in the direction of granting some opportunities for detracking. But now in the preparation for their elections, they bluntly stated, we are not going to work on detracking. We abandon the policy of detracking schools. So this will be more problematic if they gain a lot of power again. But schools are allowed to detrack. It's their own choice to track. But it's on their own initiative. So there is this scheme that schools can apply for if they want to detrack. And we help them from our university program in RPPs, Research Practice Partnerships. We support teachers to overcome all the challenges in their school organization by providing evidence and support, empirical support for their detracking policies. And we hope that we can provide compelling evidence that detracking really helps. But we need much more research to do so. So we made this review on detracking in the Netherlands, and the research evidence in the Netherlands is quite limited. So we have to learn a lot from the US, from US studies that indeed show that detracking is positive for students. But we also suffer from large ideological frameworks in which we discuss issues related to inequality and diversity. If we look at our evaluation of inequality, so we have inequality dashboards by the Ministry of Education, we have reports of the Dutch Inspectorate regarding inequality, we see a strong emphasis on meritocratic positional aspects, such as what is the track position of students, how do they perform. So it's rather focused on the efficiency and effectiveness of educational outcomes, and we try to neglect all other, more broader psychological effects, such as well-being, vulnerability, all the important concepts that Professor Graham talked about. It's not in our schemes of evaluating schools in terms of their inequality policies. But we can have a different approach on inequality and diversity to focus more on public values like inclusion, social cohesion, and citizenship, to provide accessible quality education for all, and not just focusing on effectiveness and tracking to get the maximum out of every child in the shortest time. We focus on broader outcomes and meritocratic focus on performance, and we differentiate without stigmatization. So tracking stigmatizes, but if you differentiate in a more flexible way, you don't stigmatize students. Final comment, because I'm running out of time, about teachers. Because teachers in these schools, they have to create the diverse context in which all students can prosper. So what we try to do is to work with teachers, and what I notice is that teachers, they incorporate our structure in their minds. So teachers in elementary schools, they look at students with these tracks in their head. So this is a pre-university student. This is a future vocational education student. So we induce fixed mindsets in primary school teachers because of our education system. So they also tend to track in primary schools in 3 ability groups. So all things that teachers do in classroom, they reflect the educational structure, thinking about abilities in terms of different tracks, group children, and provide different opportunities to learn, and provide them also with different quality of education. So this is a book that we made with colleagues. It's called Working on Educational Opportunities, Equal Opportunities, for primary school teachers, that focuses on how you can create a positive classroom climate, a welcoming classroom context, high expectations for all students, non-fixed ability mindsets to create real opportunities for all students. So, but I wanted to show with this picture that we should not analyze teachers' work in isolation, but they are part of this whole school system in which we group students, we segregate students. So this is the way we deal with students, and teachers are just one actor who does so. So I think there is much room for discussion, and I will end this talk with a big thank you.